The webinar is split into 6 parts. I will very briefly introduce to some of the motivations of global software engineering, or GSE as we call it. Will then summarize a few challenges, then give an overview into how to prepare, set up such projects. I will then bring a set of risks, the top 10 from the recent client projects. And I mentioned already there had been a shift, if I go a 5-year backwards until today, in terms of what are the major risks. I should also say that the motivation factors have very much changed, so this goes hand in hand. But I will talk about that later. And then I will give also an outlook, where do we go from here in terms of GSE. And I have a few takeaways in terms of best practice summary at the end, where I will also show you some literature for further reading, but also point to a conference, which is the IEEE International Conference on Global Software Engineering, which is each year in August, and will be this year in Bari, Italy in mid-August. So that is also a very good source to meet both practitioners from industry or people in research who are working on topics like collaboration and etc. So this being said, let's go ahead. And first of all, I would like to emphasize where are we at the moment with respect to GSE, what are the motivation, but also what is the evolution. On this slide there's a few quotes, which I don't want to go into too much detail, except that the one quote on the left-hand side shows that still today the sourcing contracts are challenged in a way that about 20% of global distributed projects are cancelled first year, 50% would not reach their targets, and an interesting number is also that 80% of companies are unhappy with their own GSE activities. A major factor is friction cost or interface cost, which is often overlooked in the initial setup, where companies primarily look to labor cost. And we see at the same time also an increase in labor cost, specifically in Asia. We have a severe shortage of engineers, skilled, competent software engineers and IT professionals in India, which used to be the major location for setting up distributed projects. We also see a major move in terms of going away from only looking to low labor cost, much more in the direction of flexibility. As an example, I work currently with a company who is in aerospace, who is clearly distinguishing their nearshore, their offshore, and their various captive activities. But the global trend, which this company has seen over the last 3 years, is that there is much more nearshore than what used to be. So the peak of offshore seems to be reached already, and today we see much more teams which are organized across 2 or 3 locations. That's the average. And with these 2-3 locations, mostly 2, that is the traditional center of R&D, and 1 which is rather nearshore, and then a 3rd one which would be offshore, that is used in order to balance both the flexibility needs and then the cost targets. Again, cost is getting less relevant. Access to competences, flexibility is getting the major driver for global engineering, both because of distributed markets, where you need proximity to the markets, but also due to the fact that in many cases the companies have realized that only the cost advantage creates so much risk downstream in terms of the friction cost that it should be handled very carefully. The number you should remember except for these cancellation rates, is what could you realistically achieve in global software engineering? And I'm here not talking about outsourcing of a specific service, which is certainly a different ballpark than global software engineering projects or distributed projects. So we're talking about distributed engineering projects. And in these distributed IT or software projects, the gain which you can reach in a sustainable or established process is typically in the neighborhood of 20, something beyond 20%. This is far less than the labor difference, because the labor cost difference is compensated to a high degree by additional traveling, by additional communication overheads, by additional cost on collaboration, by sometimes a trade-off. I see that quite often, that companies tend to not scale up, for instance, their IT in order to be suitable for such global projects. For instance, bandwidth of the IT connections is very critical. However, more than half of the companies we are consulting with do not have sufficient bandwidth, and you talk with the people on either end and they complain about the low performance. Now this is really a very tiny example, but it's applicable to a majority of the companies, and it's one of the reasons for frictions, and it's of course also a demotivational factor. So bringing all that together, the major thoughts which I want to give you at the beginning is, first, don't take labor cost differences as the primary reason, because they tend to be compensated by additional friction cost. 20% is feasible. Anything beyond is quite difficult to achieve. And second, these global projects have numerous risks, and it's good to know these risks in advance so they can also handle them. The globalization is still growing, I mentioned that, and the growth rates are still depending of course on the industry, in double-digit rates. Traditionally, IT had started quite early. Other industries are a bit later. For instance, if you look to embedded systems, we see only recently growth. This is also due to the fact that traditionally skilled embedded software engineers had only been accessible in Europe and United States. This has changed in the meantime. So we will see certainly also evolution along these other industries. So we have still this high growth rate, but as I say, the question is much more on talent and efficiency. And when I say efficiency, what I mean is, by having a global project, by having a distributed project, of course, on one side, your deficiencies in project management, in development, etc., come on the table. But at the same time, you also have a good chance to cure these deficiencies because you're aware of that. And this is what I see as a major efficiency lever. So it's not so much the labor cost difference, but much more, if you prepare well for collaborative development, you will see that your processes in total will very much evolve for the better. And this is a lesson which I've seen over the past 2-3 years in many international companies, even mid-sized companies, that with the right preparation, where they would first improve their project management, their processes for development, etc., and to choose the right tools, etc.,